Okay, everybody, here it is, the last part of period 4, part 6, the South and slavery. We've talked a lot in period 4 about all of the cool things happening with industrialization in the North, even the Second Great Awakening, and most of those reform movements from part 5 were predominantly located in the North. So finally, we're going to take a look at what the heck was happening in the South and what made it very distinctly different culture and place than the North and the West were becoming. So, a few big ideas. It's important to remember that the South remained politically, culturally, and ideologically distinct from the North, no matter how many times we sort of see the creation of a more American culture, all those books that were being created, all that art that was being created that was predominantly in the North. The South is going to create its very own separate culture. Politically, it's going to be aligned and organized very differently than we're going to see in the North and the West. We're going to see the overcultivation of land in the Southeast, and we're going to start to see a need for Southerners to begin moving west in order to keep their plantations up and running, which is going to cause even greater problems when it comes to sectional tensions, because those Southerners are going to start moving west, and they're going to want to start turning that open land into states, which is going to, again, throw off the balance of free and slave states in Congress. States' rights, the theory of nullification, and racist stereotyping are going to give the South their defense of slavery. They are going to use those three things as why they believe slavery is good and why it should be protected. African Americans throughout the country, but even more so in the South, are going to develop all sorts of overt and covert ways to resist both the racist practices and rules and institutions that are created, as well as resist the dehumanizing nature of slavery. And we are going to start to see the beginning of the abolitionist movement really take off. While it is important to know that there was only a minority of people in the North who were truly abolitionists, there is going to start to be a push for the ending of slavery. Now, just a quick historical reminder, slavery in America really took off after Bacon's Rebellion. It's not to say that slaves weren't originally brought here. They were in 1619, but we're going to see a massive influx of slaves into America after Bacon's Rebellion, because Bacon's Rebellion is going to cause a lot of plantation owners to be fearful of continuing to bring in more indentured servants, and instead they're going to turn almost completely to black slavery or chattel slavery. In the 1780s, we're going to see slavery relatively protected by the Constitution. It will be debated, but it is very clear that the founding fathers and the writers of the Constitution were okay with the continuation of slavery, with the inclusion of the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, the fact that they allowed the slave trade to continue even if only until 1808, and the fact that they allowed for the Fugitive Slave Act to also be included and protected. When America was creating that Constitution, it is also important to know that most of the northern and middle states were either ending slavery, so that light green color, those were the states that ended slavery. The other green is the color of people who are going to start to gradually allow emancipation, meaning they were going to let it end over a period of time. This other green color, this is the Old Northwest. According to the Northwest Ordinance, slavery was banned here. So really the North, really from the Revolution forward, is going to start really pushing for the ending of slavery. On the other hand, the other half of the country is not. The Missouri Compromise really pushes the country to have to focus in on the debate over slavery. For the most part, it was really balanced at first, but as we start to move west across the Louisiana Purchase, we will see the debate for slavery really heat up. The Missouri Compromise, again, really put a Band-Aid on a very, very big problem. So why slavery? Why was it so important? It had so much to do with the fact that when tobacco began to fail in the South, the new crop that the South took on was cotton. Now, cotton was not an easy crop to grow. It was not an easy crop to pick. It was difficult to pick because it did not all reach its peak at the same time, which meant it had to be picked by hand, hence the need for a massive labor force. After the creation of the cotton gin, that will push for an even greater need for the production of more cotton, and therefore the picking of more cotton, and therefore the demand for more slave labor. As the North industrialized, their demand for Southern cotton also increased. So the combination of both the market revolution and the cotton gin really pushed the South even further entrenched into their need and desire to maintain slavery. Those plantation owners were some of the wealthiest people in the country, and it was because of the fact that they owned humans and land, and that they were able to continue to produce the most needed product in this new growing manufacturing economy. As you can see, from 1820 to 1860, which is the start of the Civil War, we see a massive influx and spread of the production of cotton. No longer is it just in sort of the traditional southern states along the original 13 colonies. It's now pushing westward all the way into Texas. The expansion of slavery is therefore also following it. All of this stuff is showing you the different density of the amount of slaves in the southern region. All of the little lines, though, are showing you all of the different routes that were taken for the Underground Railroad. So as slavery continued, and as there was clearly a desire to end slavery in the North, again for a multitude of reasons, there was a push to try and free as many people from slavery as possible. The continued debates over slavery do not end with the Missouri Compromise. As America begins to move westward, especially after the Mexican-American War and America's purchase/win of the entire Western seaboard, as well as their eventual ownership of the Oregon Territory, we will get to the point that they then have to make decisions about slave states and free states again. After the Missouri Compromise, the next big one is going to be the Compromise of 1850. That's going to be the inclusion of California. California is going to enter as a free state, but then we have all of this other land that has to be dealt with. And that's where we get then the Kansas and Nebraska Act, which is going to create a problem down here. Should these states be free? Should they be slave? It is going to get bloodier and bloodier as the closer we get to the Civil War. Now, the South, like I said, had a very distinct culture and had a very distinct political system. It was 100%, for the most part, an agrarian society that was completely controlled by cotton. It lacked industrialization. Most factories were located in the North and the West, and most money had been invested in slave labor. So at this point, it was very difficult economically for the South to go in any other direction unless by force. And so there was nothing that the North could really do to convince them that that was what they should do. 25% of the population in the South owned slave. Only 25%. The majority of Southerners were not slave owners, but they were easily tricked into continuing to practice or defend slavery because, again, there was a group of people that were below them. So even poor white people, they might not have as much, they might not have had as much political power, but they were told to be hopeful that one day they could own slaves, one day they could be plantation owners, one day they could be super wealthy. So that tiny little sliver of hope of one time finding, at some point in your life, finding success of becoming wealthy allowed them to really defend slavery, even though they themselves didn't actually own slaves. Southern politics was considered an oligarchy since, for the most part, it was controlled by very few, very, very wealthy people. Those plantation owners made all the rules, made all the laws. Again, part of the reason why public education didn't spread in the South was because those plantation owners paid for private tutors. So they were not interested in providing taxes for public education for any of the poor white people in the region. They had a very strict class system in the antebellum South. On the top were the Southern plantation owners, followed by small slave owners, followed by the yeoman farmers, the small farmers who owned no slaves, followed the people of the pine barrens, or the people who lived more in the backwoods. And then down at the bottom, underneath all of that, would have been free Black people, and underneath that would have been people who were enslaved. This obviously contrasted greatly with the North, where we did start to see the inclusion of a larger middle class. We started to see the ability for a little bit more upward movement economically. While both parts of the country had extreme racism, the fact that the class system really did not include African Americans really showed just how, limiting it was for anyone who was free and Black in the country. There was also very much so, a lack of immigration to the South. Many Europeans didn't agree with slavery. And more importantly, they didn't like slaves because they felt them as competition. Even the Irish in particular felt particularly attacked by the idea of slavery because they were already working the lowest paying jobs and they could not compete against free labor. The Southern population, though, it is important to know the deeper in the South you went, the more the population was actually made up of African Americans. So the further we go south, we'll start to see, especially again, South Carolina, Mississippi, the majority of people living there were actually Black. And more importantly, were enslaved Black people. We saw a bit of free African Americans as well, but for the most part, it was we start to see that grand predominance of slaves down in the deep South. At the same time, we do start to see the creation of a lot of African American communities, both in the North and the South, because again, not all African Americans were in fact enslaved. As you can see, these small little slivers of red, we do see some free Blacks throughout the country. In the North, we do start to see them create their own communities. There were about 250,000 free Black African Americans in the North. But again, there was a lot of racism, especially from the Irish, because of the fact that the Irish felt so tense about now having to compete with another group for the low skilled jobs that they were after, or that they could get in those cities. Also, for many African Americans in the North, they found that there was very limited access to housing and education. So another part of the reason why they oftentimes had to create their own separate communities. Very successful in protecting each other, but not necessarily part of the large benefits of the market revolution and industrial revolution. In the South, we see an increase in the free Black population as well. Again, very similarly, about 250 to 300,000 free Blacks in the South, but they had even more restrictions on their daily life, especially as we start to see an increase in the number of slave rebellions that happen. We'll start to see increased pressures, discrimination, violence on many of the free Black people in the South. Slavery at this time is continuing to expand through the South. Chattel slavery is the only type of slavery that exists in America at this point. So again, slaves being treated and bought and sold as property, but that does not necessarily mean that that's what everybody believed in. Harriet Beecher Stowe famously wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, where she wrote and tried to bring up all of the sort of the injustices done with slavery, and she was part of the reform movements in the North. The book really tried to address a lot of the violence that was done to many of the people in slavery and the idea that many of these slave families were broken up. This becomes one of the most widely sold books in America. In the North, it is loved. In the South, it is hated. And in response to it, the South actually becomes increasingly more strict when it comes to slavery. And they really start pushing sort of against a lot of what's happening in this text. In regards to African American culture, again, African Americans were not just existing in America, they were creating their own unique culture, separate oftentimes from white culture. It really emerged as a blending of both African and American cultural influences. The Second Great Awakening did not just impact white people, it also impacted many, many African Americans, and many of them started their own churches in response to this push for revivalism. So we'll start to see Baptist and Methodist church specifically run and controlled by African Americans. They were oftentimes practicing very differently than the Baptists and Methodists in the northern region or with the white churches. They oftentimes were more practiced more responsorial style preaching, which was really drawing on a lot of West African traditions. So again, that blending of both sort of the American, Second Great Awakening religions and a lot of sort of African traditions. We'll also begin to see them printing their own newspapers, their own books, their own poetry, and creating, again, their own separate individual culture. And we'll continue to see slavery resisted in a number of different ways. In terms of slavery being resisted by those who are enslaved, we saw lots of different forms, whether it was work slowdowns, just like meaning they're literally slowing down the pace in which they're working, negligence or breaking equipment, or running away, again, participating in the Underground Railroad and helping free other people who had been enslaved, as well as revolting. Slave revolts were not very common, but there are a few that you should pay attention to. The two really, really big ones would be the Stono Rebellion and Nat Turner's Rebellion. The Stono Rebellion happened really early on. It actually happened before the revolution, but it will lead to stricter laws even when it was still just colonies. The Stoner Rebellion occurred in South Carolina. A group of slaves attempted to run away to Florida, to Spanish Florida, and they weren't allowed to go in, and they ultimately were captured, and then they were killed. With Nat Turner's rebellion, Nat Turner was taught to read, and he was asked by his slave owner to actually work on helping to convert many of the other slaves. Well, he became a massive leader of not just religion, but also a leader of one of the largest slave revolts in American history. His revolt gathered together slaves from multiple different plantations, and they revolted against their owners. In the middle of the night, they went in and they began killing their owners and their families and began to try and leave the South. Ultimately, they were eventually caught and killed, but they killed 60 people in their revolt. And so while it wasn't in the end fully successful, again, the idea was that it was the most successful, and it did spread this message that there was a revolt starting to build up amongst even the slaves themselves. So a lot of the stories that the Southerners told about, look at our happy slaves, look at how well we're treating them, this was really proving otherwise. In response, though, the Southerners oftentimes responded in far stricter laws. The Black Codes were passed at this time, creating very strict laws for both enslaved African Americans as well as free Blacks, as well as the creation of more slave patrols. So patrols who would actually follow the Underground Railroad routes and try and capture slaves. Another push to end slavery, the larger push to end slavery, known as the abolitionist movement, took on many different forms. The very first sort of group of abolitionists in America were really the Quakers. They were the first group who really were opposed to slavery. So think back to William Penn in Pennsylvania. They were pacifists, and they oftentimes, they weren't very violent in their fighting for it, but nonetheless, they were very oppositional to slavery. The next big group would have been the American Colonization Society. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to help transport any free slaves back to Africa. And the problem with their idea, though, is by 1822, many of the people who were still enslaved had never actually been to Africa. But they had an idea, and they actually purchased a territory in Africa known as Liberia. And they began, in fact, shipping any free African Americans who wanted to go back to Africa. David Walker, he was an African American who wrote this appeal. It was called the Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And he called for both education of oneself and a massive uprising. His appeal, though, he needed to get it to people who were enslaved. So what he would do is it's a very small book. If we were in my class, I could show it to you. It's a very, very small book. But what he would do is he would tear apart the pieces, and he would sew each of the pages into clothing. And then they would get that clothing to the people who were enslaved, and then they just have to put it together to get the whole document, and then be able to read what he was suggesting, which was this idea that they needed to really educate themselves to become more white than white people, in the sense that they really needed to learn the ways of white people to figure out their weaknesses so that they could ultimately rise up and take on and end the institution of slavery. A big tool that many of the abolitionists used was publications, the most famous of that being William Lloyd Garrison. He was a member of the American Anti-Slavery Society in Boston, and he called for the immediate uncompensated emancipation, meaning he believed that slaves should be freed immediately and Southern slave owners should receive nothing in return. He published a newspaper called The Liberator, which hired a young man by the name of Frederick Douglass to write for them. Eventually, Frederick Douglass chose to write his own book called The North Star. Sojourner Truth, another famous author as well. Both Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth were both former slaves who had run away or had gotten out of slavery and were now advocating for abolition. Their voices were probably the most powerful of the abolitionist movement, most notably Frederick Douglass especially. He was actually the most photographed person in the 1800s, and he would take a lot of time to really decide how to place himself in his picture, because he knew lots of people would collect the pictures. Totally side note, it's important to know that photography was brand new during this time. And so a lot of people couldn't necessarily afford to sit for a photo. They couldn't pay to get it done. But what they could do is they could buy photos. So people would just collect photos of strangers, of people that they heard of or knew. And so you'd have like a collection of random pictures, almost like baseball cards. So Frederick Douglass would have been a very big one to have. Another thing that the abolitionist movement did is they did try to create their own political party called the Liberty Party. And again, their main focus was on abolition. Now, last but not least, the South did not take any of this lightly, and they attempted to defend slavery full-heartedly. One of the first things they did in Congress was they passed the Gag Resolution, which banned any anti-slavery petition or talk in Congress. This existed in Congress from 1836 to 1844. So in other words, if any senator or member of the House of Representatives tried to bring up abolition, it would immediately be shut down. They banned teaching slaves to read or write, so they hopefully could better control them. Really, honestly, the best way to control people is to keep them uneducated. It makes it very hard for them to know or want. And so by keeping them from being able to read or write, even if they were able to escape, many people would find it very hard to get out of the South without the capacity to read or write. Southern states also adopted very strict slave codes. Part of it was the Nat Turner Revolt. Part of it was other revolts around the world for slavery. So their slave codes were the way in which they treated or punished slaves if they did anything wrong. They banned anti-slavery messages from Southern mail. So what they literally would do is they broke federal law. They would open people's mail, and if there was anything about abolition, they would get rid of it or they would cross it out of people's letters. And they actually wrote their own pro-slavery books trying to argue why slavery was good. They argued that slaves were treated as members of the family, so therefore they were treated better than other people. They were better than a wage slavery, which is what they referred to people working in factories as members of the wage slaves, or that they were wage slaves. They suggested that the way they treated their slaves was way better than factory owners treated their factory workers. And they really saw themselves as civilizing an inferior people. So they really acted as if like God was telling them to do this. And that remains sort of a very strong focus even when slavery ends. This picture right here, just to point out, is actually a picture that used to exist in textbooks here in this country. And it was arguing that slavery wasn't as bad as people made it sound, that actually slaves were pretty happy about living in slavery. So as you can see, even when slavery technically ends, even after the Civil War, there's still a push in the South of sort of changing the message of history. So this push and defense of slavery really continues even today.